Okay, this is probably one of the more important videos I'm ever going to make. So listen up, because this is super important. Today we're going to talk about the energetic dynamics of love. Dynamic of love. Now, what I mean when I say energy. So this is just, now obviously if you're coming here to this channel or whatever, I'm talk a lot about the nature of energy and how the underlying dynamics of reality works. So that way, when we interface with it, because a lot of what we're talking about is feelings, energy, seeing things. But then what happens is that energy is going to relate out in the world, kind of like looking at everything through like a glass distortion. The best way to explain it actually is like a video game, okay? So a video game, actually let me use this example. Okay, so this is a game controller. You guys all know a game controller, right? So this game controller, you know, it's a PlayStation 4 controller. It's got the main pad here. You got the 4 buttons, right? And then you got your 2 joysticks. You got your triggers, right? Everybody, if you played with a game controller, you know it. Now, depending on the game, the buttons are going to do different things. So if you're playing like an RPG, the main button you're going to use is X, probably. And there's kind of a standard language for games where this is the enter button, this is the exit button. So when you say no, you press this button. When you say yes, you press this button. When you want to do something interesting, this is typically the jump, menus. The start is the menu. If you're on a shooter, the triggers are the shooting, right? What happens is the controller, regardless of the game, is always the same. The controller is always the same. But what it does based in the game changes. That's a really, really important concept to understand because you're doing that all the time in real life, but I don't think people realize that. So what it is when you're talking to a person, when you go to the store, when you use money, when you're doing everything, you are using the ultimate same interface, the same controller. You're using the same controller. You are the controller, your experience. But the program, the software, the game you're running can change based off of which circumstance you're in. When you're at work, you're going to be playing a different game than when you're on a date. And you're going to be playing a different game when you're on a date versus when you're in a social situation. And you're going to be in a different controller set when you're playing basketball, when you're doing these things. The reason life is so difficult is because we have to change the program that we're in. And obviously, the more robust a program is, the more different things we can accommodate. So that's really, really important to understand. But the buttons are the same. But the program is different. And so because the program, the software is different, we do different things in the game. Now, the difficulty is if you use first-person controls. So let's say you're playing, you like first-person shooters, and you try to play a certain type of game using, here, I actually should have drew the board, right? So we're going to break this down. And the reason I'm going to talk about it like a game is so that you guys can understand it. So I'm using the gaming concept first, but this will extend into the nature of love and what we're talking about. But this is a really important concept because I realize I see it all the time and it's just kind of natural in my head. And I think because of that, I've come to a fairly simple yet profound understanding of love and the nature of relationships and dynamics. So I'm trying to explain that to you guys. So let's say here you have a shooter game. And over here you have a sports game. I'm just going to keep this really simple. And then over here you have, let's say, an adventure game, okay? So this is for people who don't necessarily play video games, but you know enough that they're different. Okay. So when you have the controller over here, so let's say you have the X button. So for this, the X button is jump. But for here, this X button is pass. While for here, the X button is interact or yes. Right? So we see here that the X button in all of these games does different things, but it's the same button press. You're pressing the same button, right? But they do different things. Now here is where we get confused in life, right? So in a shooter, let's say in the adventure game, circle, right? Let's say in the shooter, this is melee. Circle is melee. So this is a Halo, by the way, because I'm coming off of this, right? And then in the sports game, this will be kick or score. Let's just say score because it's basketball, right? And then in the adventure game, this is where we got circle is jump. Now, this is super key and this is jump or no, depending on the menu. Now, this is very interesting, and this is where we get our wires crossed up, right? So the controller is the same, right? But depending on the type of game you're playing, if you press circle when you want to jump in an adventure game, that makes sense. But if you press circle when you want to jump in a shooter game, you're going to do a melee attack. And then you're going to hit instead of jump. And then what happens, or even worse circumstance, let's say there's a game where you want to jump or you want to say yes, but you end up saying no without meaning to because you weren't aware of what game you were playing. This is where understanding what software we're playing is so important, right? Just in the gaming context, right? We can understand that in terms of a game. That makes sense in a game, right? So if I want to jump, if I press the wrong button based off the wrong game, you'll get your wires crossed and you'll make a mistake and you'll do the wrong thing. Now, luckily in game there's do-overs, but in real life, we don't get the same luxury of do-overs. So we have to be aware of what kind of program we're playing, right? And what kind of game we're playing. That's the most important thing. So we have to know what type of game we're playing because the controller is always the same. Now that is really, really important. That's the first level to this thinking, right? Is that you have to understand that the controller is the same. So the controller is you. The controller is you and your options. But the program, now the game is the software, or actually in this case, it's the dynamic you're playing. It's the dynamic or the relationship, right? So we understand that so I'm going to move away from the game controller, but hopefully that'll make some sense so that the rest of this will fly and be clear. So if you understand that there's the controller, there's the game, and then there's obviously we're going to go and we're going to call it the console, right? The console is life. This is where you get the power or the energy as well as the intent. This is where you change things out. So life, and then you could even and then this is where we're going to call the mind, or we can call this the universe. There's a lot of things we're going to call this, right? We can even, I'm not going to go God because the concept of God is actually a little different than the concept of the universe. A lot of people are like, oh, it's the same thing, but it's like, when you use the word of God and use the word context of the game, it's a little different, especially in the way I use it. So we're just going to use my terminology and I'm just going to standardize my use of those words. So These are the three fundamental components of the console, the game, and the controller. You, okay? Now, I want you to think of these things in three levels, right? So the controller is how you interface with the rest of the game, right? So this is your body. The game, the dynamic you're taking on, this is your mind. And then the console, life, power, energy, the universe, this is your spirit. Okay? That's the breakdown. So when you work on the body, you're controlling the mind. When you upgrade the mind, you're basically updating the software. But this is really, really important because just like you can change your mind, you can change the software program. This is something a lot of people don't understand because a lot of people stay rigid and they only play one type of game. And they only ever move to game types that fit within that because they're not willing to learn or adapt or learn new controls for a different type of game. And that what that does is that creates a very rigid dynamic in which they live their lives. So the reason I word dynamic is dynamic can be lifestyle. Dynamic can be the types of relationships like have. The dynamic can be your day-to-day. That's what I mean. So this is the kind of game you're playing. And this is really important. This is where this all sits within the mind. And remember, so a lot of times people are trying to build out the controller and they're working on their body. Now, this is another thing that's in the body is resources because this is in the world, right? And I really want to emphasize this idea that the body, the mind, and the spirit, obviously they're one and the same. But in this understanding of third degree, they are different. And if you really want to understand love in the dynamic that I'm going to explain to you, it's super important that you can make these distinctions, right? So if you have any questions so far, place it down in the comments below so I can address it. Obviously, we're not doing this live. I'll be able to talk to you about it. But this separation of dynamics is super, super critical to understand what it is we're talking about, just in terms of like how we energetically move through the world, right? And you might be like, well, what do you mean the energy? Well, if we all know that we're energy, we can sense it. And you know what I'm talking about if you know that. If you don't understand, look at my video on the 7 degrees of law and you'll see an explanation there so we don't go too far off track. So this is really, really important. Now, today we're going to talk about love. And in order to understand love, it's super important that you understand what all these resources mean. So there's physical resources. There is a universal resource, which is we generate. So from the basis of reality, there's this thing called matter and intelligence. That's it. It's all there is. Intelligence is the masculine potential. Matter is the feminine potential in terms of energy. And if you understand these things, you'll understand. So feminine brings consciousness. Consciousness in the sense that it brings energy or frequency. So that which is your consciousness is just your solid frequency, right? Your way your mind works. And masculinity brings intent. It brings intent or attention. And when you take attention and you take frequency, you bring those together, that creates consciousness. And consciousness then becomes everything you experience in life. And then when you split your consciousness in 3 ways, you split the consciousness into 3 ways, you get spirit, mind, and body. Okay? So that's the terminology we use. So it's all one thing, which is just the giant whole universe. Split that into the second 2 things, which is matter, intelligence. Split that into 3 things, mind, body, spirit. That makes sense? I hope so. because we're just going to keep on moving. If you do, put those questions down below. If it's all making sense, say it makes sense and let me know in the comments below, because I need to always know how these things are being received, and it's super important. Half the time I'm just kind of teaching myself as well. To learn and think about this and kind of have it in my head, being able to finally put it all out is super nice. Okay, so now that we have those 3 fundamental separations, when we're here in our physical world, there are 3 primary sources of energy that we receive and that we generate. Just 3. And so the human being, if you think about it, I'm just going to do a human being. Ooh, I'm a human being, right? When you think of, so there we are, human being, kind of like a star, okay. This is a human being, okay? So human beings, we have output, input, binary universe, so in, out, right? Or in, out. I-O, okay. So we're pretty simple. We receive energy and then we put out energy. It's this constant thing, right? There's always examples of this in terms of our breath, in terms of our eating. It's this cycle, and it works with everything else. Everything comes in, out, in, out, in, out, like a breath, right? So there are 3 primary sources of energy. And it's important to know the terminology so that you understand. At this unit of the base unit is attention. Attention is what we give in the physical realm, in the body. Attention is the most distilled, unrefined version of the energy that we give. You would call it attention. Or you call it the most refined because it's the one that's gone through the most layers of fracture, right? But attention is what we call it. And so, attention. And then in the mind, we would call it connection or thought. Now, the difference between giving something attention versus giving something actual thinking power, it's like the difference between paying attention to someone versus thinking about them. That's the basic difference of them, right? And so the idea is that when you're with them, you're able to give them your full focus and your attention, right? And all this is matched by what we would call the level of presence one has in their life. So you'll call this presence, okay? So presence is what comes in, or what we put into any dynamic, right? It's what we put into it. So we have to give presence. And so the last level of presence, you nailed it, you know it, it's love. And love connects the spirit. And I just want you guys to think of this in terms of fuel, right? This is all fuel. So when we have presence, we give attention to something, to the body. When we have ultimate presence, we also give energy to the mind through our thoughts and connections. Ideas is another way, right? Ideas, which is just a thought, form, another word for a thought form. This is mind, thought, ideas. And then when we get spirit, it's love. And so love is unconditional, energetic regard. And you might be like, what do you mean is unconditional energetic regard? It is super important that you recognize it's unconditional, because what happens is when you give something love, obviously when you give something a time and attention. Now, all of these are bound by the constraints of their respective spheres. So attention is limited by time and space, right? The mind is limited by exposure and experience, or knowledge, right? Because your mind is the amount of connection we can feel is based off the level of exposure we have and knowledge of someone. So obviously, if we want to feel more connected to someone, we expose ourselves to them more and we learn more about them, right? By giving something lots of our attention in terms of presence, we allow it into our time and space. Now, if you want to give it into love, the bounds of love is that it is unconditional. It is without limitation. So if you want to know how do I give someone love in terms of my presence, expose yourself to them, learn a lot about them, and then match time and space. That's it. And then you will naturally start fueling love. And love will build the spirit of that dynamic, right? Because remember, we have dynamics, and then we have the underlying framework of reality, the spirit, which is basically the energy. And when we have the energy of that being, it will grow. Simple as that. It will grow. Simple as that. So body, give it attention. Mind, give it connection, thought, and ideas. And the spirit, once we get there, once we do these two things, this will naturally turn on. And then once we expose ourselves and give knowledge, so exposure is vulnerability and then knowledge. Now you might think exposure, knowledge this is about what I'm putting in, like exposing about myself. No, this is actually love goes two ways, right? So it's in and out. The love that actually makes a difference, that actually creates growth, is not about the love we receive. It's about the love we give. So when we create a space, time and space, where people can be vulnerable and we accept the knowledge of them, and then we move into a place of obviously acceptance. So you could call it just acceptance here. But when we move into a place where we allow deeper levels of vulnerability, deeper levels of knowledge to be shared, and we create that time and space, naturally love will cultivate in that space. Just energetically, it's like math. It has to happen, right? So the idea is, do we create knowledge, time, and space? Now and then we give output. Output is the same thing. We create attention on the same way. Attention comes out. So attention comes out. Connection. So that's connection is exposure, so vulnerability, ideas, and then acceptance. Once acceptance happens, then eventually you build to love. And this is how all relationships with everything is built. Now, this is, you guys, the bestest way to explain. This is what we're talking at, is the level of the console or the computer, right? So love, remember, just as a rehash so that we're keeping track of what we're talking about, this is the console, this is the game or the dynamic, and this is the controller. So the controller is always going to be the same, and the console is always going to be the same. The thing that changes is the game, the dynamic. That's the thing that changes. So when people say love between a mother and father, or love between a lover, or love between a brother and sister are different, what they're talking about is the game. They're talking about the nature of the connection or the dynamic. They're not really talking about love, but we've gotten so divorced from language. And the Greeks used to actually, that's why the Greeks would have 4 different words for it, right? So they called, here at love, they would call it agape, right? And then here at the level, here they had then 3 different ones. You had storge, eros, and philia. And then our controller, you would call it, was just the ego, right? Our persona. And these were the words we used because we had refined language then, but we don't have refined language now. So a lot of times people get this confused. But really the thing that changes is the game, the relationship, the dynamic that we have with people, the nature of the connection we're creating, right? That's what changes. But love, the actual love that makes that grow and that creates presence, that comes through presence, that doesn't change. That doesn't change. But these are the attention dynamics. right? These are the energy of what is going on. So if you're like, well, Oni, what do you mean? I have all these examples. Well, for me to start plugging this into any relationship dynamic and anything, so we're going to talk about all the different ways that goes astray, which is going to be super cool. You have to fundamentally understand and accept this premise first. If you accept and understand this, everything will make a lot more sense. I promise you. But you have to fundamentally understand and be able to break it down. So you have to be able to understand, okay, if I have a certain relationship dynamic with a friend, that's the nature of our connection. But I'm not feeling a level of unconditional regard there. I'm not feeling like it's plugged on, right? And that's because the level of exposure and knowledge is not current to the connection. And that's because there's not enough time and space given. And naturally, with distance is a factor of time and space. So this is where some things can happen. And so some people might be like, well, there's some people I can put down and it's picking up right where we left off. That's because you guys have that same dynamic. That game is saved, right? And then when you put that down, you might still be able to interact with it fully and completely, right? But that's because you have to know that the nature of the connection that you have with that person is still the same game. So when the difficulty is one person is playing a shooter and the other person is playing an adventure game. And then what happens is they clash because now they're playing different games. So they can't cooperate or play the game together. Now they're competing because they're playing a game where they have conflicting controls, right? And so that's where you have to understand what is the nature of the game and the dynamic we have, and what is the nature of what we're doing. And this is what's very interesting is once you start understanding this, just like you understand, once you buy a console, the controller is the same. The console is the same. Where the juice is in the game. There is an infinite amount of different games we can play. And that's when we start talking about the different types of genres and the standards of each game we can play, even to the point where we start customizing or making our own games without knowing it. And so oftentimes when we're talking about a connection with someone, we're talking about the nature of the game we have with them. But you have to understand a dynamic and a relationship you have with someone is not about whether or not it's love. Love has nothing to do with it. And if you can learn to separate those, dynamics and human relationships will make a lot more sense, right? Even, and also not only human relationships, but the way we work with other people. And this is all really, really important. This, I would say, of all the things I've kind of gone over today, this is the most important framework to understand, is that you have to be able to divide between attention, connection, and love. You have to know what those things are. You have to understand, am I giving my attention? Am I giving my presence, right? Because presence is what you put in, right? And then what you get out is regard. And I can use that word, or a more common word, rather than presence. I would say the thing you receive, someone gives presence, the other person, I would say, receives, you would call it love, we'll call it care. The other person receives care. And that is the most important thing, is that when you put presence in, you receive care. That person receives care. When that person puts presence in, you receive care. And so when people say love yourself, what they're saying is give your own presence to your sense of self. But this is where we talk about what is the sense of self, right? So that's when you can get into the idea of what is the self, what is all this. And this is when we need to talk about the nature of love, because when people use that word, they are not talking about it in the sense that the ancient literature and all the countless things have made love out to be. And the idea is that when we understand the nature of love, it will mechanically create certain results. So when love is given fully, it creates a sense of care, certainty, faith, And it's generally positive because, again, it is unconditional, energetic regard. It's unconditional. So you might say, well, in that case, we very rarely experience love. Yes, we very do rarely experience love. And I'm going to give you one more example, and then we're going to cut this video. I still want to talk more about the energetic, because there's a lot of layers to this. There's a lot of layers to this video, but I'm just going to make this one video because I think it's important that people understand this dynamic. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about different games we play using the same energetic resources, right? But it's important that we understand what is the standard of energy that is going on at the most basic level, right? And the thing is, this is obviously everything I just taught to you today, by the way, guys, is what's called the 3rd degree framework. So once again, if you don't know that, go check out my video on the 7 levels of law. So that makes sense, because this is the 3rd degree framework, which is the most complete framework for a human being. But there's obviously other frameworks, 5th degree, 6th degree, where there's more steps, but it only gets more complicated. But it's less abstract. But if this is too abstract for you, put it down in the comments below so we can have a conversation about it, because these abstractions, when understood, I promise, will have the biggest bang for your buck. It creates a tremendous amount of clarity when you understand them. Any more steps than this or more words or whatever creates more confusion. So if you feel like you're confused now, comment down the word below, and then I can do that. And then we can have that conversation, because I think it's super important to understand what it is when we're talking about love, qualities, relationships, etc. Anyway, so let's talk about the economics of what this is. So when you have attention, you have the connection, and then you have love, which is unconditional self-regard, right? Now, it's really important, because once you get to the level of spirit, actually, I'm going to use different colors here so we can have this separation. But once you get to the level of spirit, where it's like, man, we have a spiritual connection, the sense of separation dissolves. So if you feel a sense of separation from someone else, you're not fully in love with them, right? Of course, people have their own sovereignty and they need to be able to sense. But when you have this experience, you'll know you've experienced true love. Like, it's unlike anything you've ever felt. So when you feel it, you know it, right? It feels like seeing God, and you're everything and you're with everyone, right? And so there's a couple things about love. When a mind has not processed exposure or knowledge, so when you don't have the mental framework for love, so the mind can't, so when a connection has not been built or understood, but love has not been attained through this attainment of attention through the time and body, what happens is it's actually quite painful. It's because, remember, now you're moving up the scale, right? Because now we're going up to the Hawkins scale, back, basic scale of shame, guilt, yada, yada, right? All the way up. And if you know this one, this is your first video, check this out, research this. But as you know, here we have courage. The idea is that as we actually know, let me have this correspond, because this is important that we understand the correspondence, right? So in terms of correspondence, the body is trapped here. Not trapped, but the body corresponds with everything below this line. Everything here corresponds with the mind. And everything here corresponds with the spirit. So here, at acceptance, joy, we start experiencing love and peace. And then enlightenment, etc. Enlightenment. At this point is when you could say you can experience pure love. It's only when you're able to feel these higher levels of vibration are you able to sustain anything that is resembling love. If you're not able to stay consistently in these places, love in its pure form is not going to make any sense to you. You don't have the mental framework for it. You haven't been exposed to it enough. You don't understand the knowledge. What's interesting is kids are able to feel this quite easily because they don't need all that knowledge. They're just exposed to it, if they're lucky, 24/7. But a lot of adults, as we learn these conditions of living, we lose our ability to stay in that. So what happens is little by little, our vibration drops down. And that might happen super fast. That might happen by the time you're 1.5 years old. And then you're just living here in guilt and shame. And then because in guilt and shame, the basic resource you need, first let's do this. And this is, I didn't go over, so let's talk about neutrality, willingness. So willingness to try. And then neutrality, willingness, and then courage, neutrality, willingness, and then let's call it openness. Reasoning, that's the one, reasoning. When you can be reasoned with. Okay. So these are the levels. These are the emotional states you have to cross through in order to be able to accept full love, the full love resource, the full resource of love, right? You have to be able to be at this higher level. Right? Until then, the only resources you'll have access to are attention. Here, the mind, it'll be connection. And here, at the level of spirit, it'll be love. Now, this is something to understand. There are some games, some dynamics that exist completely down here. So if you have a dynamic where your mind, body, and spirit vibrationally, so this is where we talk about, obviously you're going to exist in here, but we're talking about level of coherence, right? So there are some games that naturally create incoherence. And those games with incoherence, they're going to be level 7, 7th degree games. And the focus on getting out of those games is going to be where you put your attention, learning how to control your attention so you can rise up out of these emotions. So this is fear, desire, apathy. Then you have anger, pride, anger, desire, fear. All these juicy emotions down here, right? Because this is where most people are. Most people are down here. So most people, they can only handle a little bit of attention. They can't handle a lot of it. And all they can really understand is attention. And I want you to think of it like a gradient of energy, right? So think of it like swimming pools. So in terms of capacity, just so that everybody understands, in terms of capacity, this would be like, obviously there's a lot of levels, but let's say courage is, when you're courageous, let's say that's like a bathtub. A bathtub. And when you're down here in guilt, this is like a thimble. And then fear is like a paper cup. Okay? It's like a paper cup. And I'm really going to try and make this mathematical so you guys can understand. And then here in your mind, let's say at the beginning of mind, you have a swimming pool. Once you've crossed over and you're a swimming pool. And then once you get into reasoning, let's say you have a giant river. And then here, once you get into love and stuff like that, this is like the ocean. And then once you get into enlightenment, this is like this is like the sky. Okay? So I want you to think of this in terms of this is the amount of emotional space. I know there's a lot in this video. So we might have to break this down. You might have to come back. I might have to split it up. but I want you to think of it in terms of an emotional space. This is what the capacity for vibration is, right? This is capacity. So when people are down here, most people, thimbles, paper cups, bathtubs, right? Once you're able to stay in the mind, you're able to have a pool or up to a river. That's just your capacity to integrate emotional reality. So this is emotions, thoughts, and the ability to act. This is coherence, right? And then love is the sky. Now, this is the emotional capacity to hold these three essential resources: attention, connection, and love. Okay? So I want you to think about it this way. And now I'm going to get kind of mathematical here, but this is just so that this makes sense. I hope it makes sense. I'm going to send this video out. But attention, I want you to think of attention as being 1 AU. We're going to call it 1 attention unit, right? And let's say to get a connection unit, and there's attention units all the way up. Every single level of emotion, you have to pay a certain level of attention to move through that emotion, okay? So we'll call this a unit of attention. And let's say shame, to unlock shame, equals 20 attention units, right? And then guilt, in order to move through guilt is 30 attention units, right? That makes sense? So you're using attention units all the way up. And everyone's one attention unit is different for every person. It's going to be different for you based off of how well you can focus, how expensive and how well you gain attention, right? Because now you're going to see the difference. So these are attention units. Once you have a certain number of attention units, in order to play here, it gets really, really expensive because now you need something called 1 connection unit. So this is the currency, okay? To play an attention unit, let's say, okay, well, all I have are attention units. So I'm trying to convert my attention units to connection units. To convert 1 single attention unit to 1 connection unit, let's say it's about, so it'd be 200. Let's say it's 200,000 attention units create 1 connection unit. So when you move here, now you need to play a different game. You need to play a different game in order to get connection unit currency. Because now it's no longer about the attention you give, it's about the amount of connection you can give. And then let's say we go up here, connection units, and so let's say to move from neutrality, you now have to get, what is it? Let's say you have to go to 15 is to go to neutrality. And then from 15, you have to go to 30. And then from 30, you have to go to 60 connection units once you get to reasoning. So 60 connection units will help you unlock reasoning. Now, if you want to get to acceptance, joy, love, acceptance is weird because acceptance, let's say acceptance is very interesting because acceptance, we'll say, is 100. Acceptance and forgiveness is 100 connection units, okay? So this is kind of like the economics of connection, right? And so once you have 100 connection units, right, now we're going to move into what we are going to call love units. So love units, right, let's say it's 100 connection units equals 1 love unit. And in order to have joy, joy just costs 1 love unit. And then love, true love, also costs 1 love unit. And peace also costs 1 love unit. And you might say, what do you mean? So one love unit, in order to feel peace, love, joy, acceptance, enlightenment, it's all the same. Why doesn't it change or convert? And that's because the difference here in whether you feel experience, love, joy, things, it's now no longer about whether or not you have love, because the love unit is the same, right? The love unit's the same. It's now, once you get to this love, it's about how many love units do you convert. So in order to have here, it's one love unit, but to feel joy. But to feel joy, you have to also give or convert to attention units. You have to take a love unit, but turn it into an attention unit. And to feel love, you have to create a connection. You have to create a connection unit. And I know you might be like, oh no, what the hell are you doing? Like this is, but I'm trying to gamify relationships so that they make sense.